In this video, we'll be looking at the Polar Fringe. Polar Fringe is a linear chroma key generator. It also features a nifty joystick. At first glance, Polar Fringe may appear to be the most specialized LZX module, but it still has quite a few tricks up its sleeve. Its basic function is to take an RGB input signal and generate a specific key based on a color, a diameter, and a fringe. In this first patch, we'll look at the most typical use case. So to begin, we need a full RGB image. Ideally, you have something with a diverse range of colors. So the Polar Fringe conveniently has an RGB through option. This is very nice because it keeps you from having to multiply the inputs. These RGB outputs are an exact mirror of the RGB inputs coming into the Polar Fringe. This is mostly there as a patching convenience. So you can see our bird friend. This is one of the included stills with the memory palace. And this has a wide range of different hues, so it will give us ideal material for keying with the Polar Fringe. So I have channel B of my visual cortex set to just plain blue. So what we're going to do now is take the key from the Polar Fringe and patch that into the keyer on the visual cortex. So immediately you can see the effect that this is having. We have both a positive key and a negative key. As you can see, those are mutually exclusive parts of the image. So as you start playing with the controls, you can begin to see what happens. If I want to just key in on the orange and yellow parts of the image, I can do it like that. I can adjust the diameter, which is going to affect how much or how little of that color is being keyed. How wide the range is, in other words. And the fringe, which is going to give me some different edge effects. If I set either of these all the way up, we're just going to get fully keyed image. So this is a pretty neat effect. Of course, you have voltage control inputs, and that's where this starts to get more interesting. So I can go to my diameter voltage control, and I can use something slower like an LFO. And I can also plug into the X voltage control, which is basically going to move this joystick in the X dimension for me. And I can go into the Y voltage control or the fringe. Of course, I can also use video rate input signals. So if I take something like an output from a prismatic ray, start to plug that into different things, start to see those vertical bars from the prismatic ray having an effect on the key. And we can also go into the X, the Y, or again, the fringe. There we go. So let's plug that back into the diameter. And then I'm going to take a ramp from Diver, just so we can get an animated source going in. Let's try that into the X voltage control. Set that to scroll, so we start to get some movement. Maybe I'll try the Y instead. There we go. So now we can start to get some animation into our keyed area. So while in this case we're using a still, we can start to animate it, get a little movement going on. You could also use full color video input here. If you shot something on a green screen, for example, this is a simple way to do some chroma keying. And you can also use it with more abstract sources. So for example, I could switch this over to a pattern I've created on my fortress. And this allows me to add an extra dimension. So you can see that blue coming in. I'll change the color so you can see exactly what part that's affecting. So those white lines now, those orange lines are coming in from the fortress. So while its most immediate use may appear to be chroma keying an external video source image, Polar Fringe can also be extremely useful in pattern and shape generation. In our next patch, we'll look at using it in that context in a more sophisticated way. Building off the last patch, this more complex example shows how Polar Fringe can be at the center of a complex pattern generation. As you can see, the joystick is still doing quite a lot. So let's break this patch down and show you how we did it. So I'm starting with the same basic setup we ended with in the last patch. I have the RGB output from Fortress going into the RGB input on Polar Fringe, the through going out to the visual cortex, and the key being used to key the compositor. If I move the joystick around, you can see we can pull out the individual colors in the Fortress output. Of course, we can adjust the diameter and the fringe, get some different effects. But what I want to do is, instead of using the Fortress's built-in oscillators, I want to get another pattern being generated with ADC1 and ADC2. Then I'm going to use some elements of those same shapes and patterns to modulate the Polar Fringe. So let's begin by using Arch to generate a simple pattern. I'm going to take a prismatic ray and go into one channel of my Arch. I'm going to take the vertical output on my diver, or any ramp generator, and go into the second. I'm going to take the absolute output, and we'll put that into ADC1. So because my diver is scrolling, I can turn that off, just to give you an idea. But because my diver is scrolling, we start to get some animation, some movement. Prismatic ray is creating vertical bars. The diver is creating the horizontal bars. And we're seeing the absolute output of that into ADC1. To make this a little bit more interesting, I'll use the rectifier as well. So I'll take the absolute output of Arch, put that into the rectifier input, and take the mirror output, and that'll give me a little bit more detail. For ADC2, I'm just going to take the max output from the Arch. There we go. So I'd like to get a little bit more movement on those shapes. So because Arch doesn't have CV controls, I'm going to use the passage. So I'll take these two inputs into two through channels of a passage. Take a couple LFOs. This is a very common patching technique if you're not familiar with. It's covered in several other videos. Then we'll go back out into the Arch. So now that gives us a little bit extra movement. Okay, so now as I move the Polar Fringe around, you can see it keying different parts. Now that background just being black isn't super interesting. One of the reasons I went to the trouble of making such an intricate basic pattern out of the diver and the prismatic ray is that I now have a bunch of interrelated stuff I can use to build a background and perform other modulations. So for the background, I'm going to take the H plus V output from diver and put that into a staircase. I'm going to take the 1 and 4 outputs here. I'm going to plug those into channel B. I'm just going to go into the red and blue inputs. Doesn't really matter what you do. And so that's going to give me a nice background pattern that's related to what's going on in the foreground. So now, as I move my Polar Fringe, this allows me to change where the background and foreground elements are. And of course, I can change my diameter and my fringe to get even more different effects. So I'm going to take this Y control and I'm going to plug a voltage control into it. I'd like to use the H minus V ramp from diver on that Y voltage control. So you can start to see what that's doing. Getting those little gray squares that kind of float. I want a little bit more control over this. So I'm going to use a doorway first. So I'll take the H minus V, go into the source, and now I can use the threshold control on my doorway to control where that gray diamond goes. And of course I can change the amount of voltage control and the starting point of the Y joystick. If I wanted to, I could switch this to outline mode as well, or I could invert it. So as you can see, we have a lot of different options here. But what I really like is that everything is staying very nice and interrelated. So the patch has a certain cohesion to it. Finally, I'm going to voltage control the diameter VC with something like, let's say, another output of the arch. So I could take the clip output. As you can see, it's giving me a nice little effect there. Sorry, the camera ran out of batteries, so we're fast forwarding just a little bit here. But the final thing we're going to do is take the other key output and put that back into somewhere else in our patch to create a feedback effect. So we could plug this into the original oscillator. It's going to give us some pretty dramatic feedback there. We could tune it down if we want. Or we could go into ADC3 on Fortress. Just bring that in just a little bit till we get that sort of texture in there. And there you go, that's a nice effect. So the polar fringe is now at the center of this entire complex pattern. So, especially when used in combination with something like a visual cortex or a marble index, the polar fringe can add a really cool layer of depth to your patterns. And while it may seem a little bit one-dimensional, in our next patch, we'll look at a more surprising use for the polar fringe. Just like pretty much all LZX modules, Polar Fringe is a pure analog processor, which means while it's labeled for a certain use case, that doesn't mean it can't be used in other ways. Polar Fringe offers a very cool way to combine basic ramps and other image sources into complex results. So let's take a look at that now. To begin, I'm going to take H and V ramps from Diver. You could also use H and V ramps from a visual cortex or really any image source. I'm just going to start plugging these into some of the color channels on Polar Fringe. So I'm going to go into the red and blue outputs. We'll take a look at the key output. So you can see as I start moving this joystick around, as I start adjusting my fringe and diameter controls, we're starting to get different combinations of these two ramps. As you can already see, this is a very unique and useful way of combining these shapes. Let's introduce a third image source with a prismatic ray. So now you can see that starting to be introduced into the mix as well. And as we start to move these, we get a lot of interesting things starting to happen. Now you'll notice as I turn the fringe up, we get a softer and softer image. The image gets harder as I turn it down. By keeping this very soft, that's going to allow us to use staircase, doorway, and other expedition processors. I'm just going to take that out for now. We'll take this positive key and go out into a staircase. Let's take one of those outputs, take a look at it. So you can see as we get this softer fringe, so we adjust the diameter. And of course, we can also adjust everything on the staircase. So this is giving us a really interesting mix of these different ramps and waveforms. We could also take the negative key and go out to, say, a doorway. I'm just going to plug this so you can quickly see what the doorway is going to look like. So we're getting the inverted version of that. And again, because we're keeping our fringe very soft, the doorway gives us a lot of control. If we pulled the fringe control all the way down, we wouldn't really get the same dramatic results from the doorway. This would also be great fodder for a topogram. So I'll go back out into that staircase. And what I'm going to do to start getting a little color involved is we'll use the Fortress as a colorizer. So right now we're seeing the basic Fortress. Let me turn that all the way down. So I'm going to put the staircase into ADC1. Start to see we're getting colorizing effect from the Fortress. Now I'll take the output from the doorway and put that into ADC2. And again, you can see what fun the joystick is having here. And we can adjust the diameter. Now let's take some simple LFOs and use these to start moving the X and Y. So I'll set these really high just so I can see the general range. Get these tuned. and then slow them down. And of course, we can also set our diver to start scrolling, which is going to add an additional dimension of movement. Of course, we could swap these different inputs, and you'll get different effects. You could also take these and insert different modulations using a passage before they hit the input. Let's just plug into a different LFO here. And so there's really a lot of fun you can have by mixing signals into your Polar Fringe. Just a quick note, the RGB outputs, in this case, are through. So you're going to just get an exact duplicate of whatever's coming into the input. That could be useful if, for example, you want to take this same ramp that's going into there and maybe apply it to some color correcting effects, or just use it in other parts of your patch. So hopefully that gives you a good idea of how to get started with your Polar Fringe. I have to admit, when I first saw Polar Fringe, I thought it was too specific of a use case and that I wouldn't find a need for it in my system. But after taking it for a spin, it's capable of a lot of really cool stuff that you wouldn't first expect. In a system of any size, small or large, it really adds a lot of flexibility to pattern patches as well as external image processing. And it's a great fit with the Fortress and Memory Palace because of their RGB outputs. I hope you enjoyed this video. And as always, please leave any questions or ideas for future videos in the comments below. Thanks for watching.